Hey there, Golden Bears. How are we doing today? I hope you're well. And yes, again, it's Steger with you on our final two sections of Module 4. So with that, let's go ahead and dive on in. And here's a little quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of our transcendentalists that you'll kind of hear often when quoting from this time period because of his clear way of phrasing certain things. And listen to this. He says, "We Americans will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds." What made Ralph Waldo Emerson so unique and his other transcendental thinkers is that they were trying to steer away from the European influence, steering away from what those authors and writers were trying to accomplish and do, and kind of establish their own form and function. And so this is a great reflection of this time period as we begin talking about the social reforms across the landscape of America. I'd like to start with the story here before we kind of begin talking about what factors contributing to this new national culture. And it kind of goes to a story that I'm almost hesitant to share, but it is of my own experience. And so I hope that some of you won't be offended by this or taken aback by it, but I just think it kind of lends itself as to changes, and especially changes over time. Some of you might know that I moved with my family for 12 years in Mexico, and it was down there that we did kind of worship and church services through a church down there, and we did a lot of other things besides that. But what we had to first learn is to go into a Mexican Spanish church and start learning everything in Spanish. And it was there that we discovered that some of the songs we were familiar with in the States, when we went to church, were completely different down there. We're like, why don't you have the same songs that we listen to up here? And it was then that the youth pastor of that church, he gave me some different musical groups that were from Mexico to listen to. And I started listening. I didn't understand all the words. It was just like how I began studying Spanish for the first time and unpacking it and what does this mean. And so it's kind of a cool cultural understanding, but also to understand how to learn Spanish, since we went down there didn't hardly know any words. But it was there that after I got accustomed to what they were talking about, as they were using different spiritual languages, scriptural passages, everything about it was different. And I remember then going back to the youth pastor, his name is Jason, and Hasson, and I go, "Hey Jason, I don't understand a little bit about where they're coming up with these opinions of things." And so he goes, "Well, let me give you a little story about Marcos Witt, of who I was listening to at the time." And he goes, "Marcos Witt grew up in the first generation of a Christian church. As you probably know, most Catholics, most of Mexico in Latin America is predominantly Catholic, and they're accustomed to a very specific, rigid way of how they do things. And in fact, the Catholic Church didn't even allow the guitar in Latin America for their church services. And so here along comes this first generation of a family that left Catholicism and embraced baptism, I guess you would call it that. And it was there that they began engaging with the guitar. And oh my gosh, you should have heard everybody railing against this church was there. Well, by the mid-1980s, these kids had come together and formed a band. And this band kind of began to resonate with many of the kids of all across the same age group, all across Mexico. And they began doing concerts and really engaging with what was going on there. Now, what made them even more revolutionary is not that they just played with now drums, electric guitars, microphones, and all this other kind of lighting and everything else. It's like a modern day kind of rock concert in the mid-80s. They did the second thing that was kind of really, really revolutionary. For a few of the songs, instead of facing the audience singing these songs of worship or song of reverence or song of call to worship, you know what they did is they completely turned all the way around, faced the cross, and they played to the audience of a different origin, of a different spiritual nature of God. And this blew not only the people in the concert away, it blew the religious leaders of the way, and many of them were supposed to be denounced for doing such a practice as this. Why do I tell this to you? Is because just as this message of God was kind of told to people in Mexico, and many Catholics accepted this way back in what we've been started talking about from 1607 and before that time, 1492 to 1607. That Catholicism has now shifted to when, by the time I got there in 2005 and 6, there had already been a few generations of practicing Christians and Catholics. And what had emerged is their own form of religious experience, their own form of religious worship, and their own form of how it should look and feel and the textures of it. And this reminds me of a lot of this thing that we're going to be talking about in this time period of the social reforms, of religious reforms found across the landscape of America. I beg of you, urge you, you need to be printing out this document here. This is going to be due, during this time period here of chapter 4.7. And so as we go through your reading and go through this lecture, you can begin filling this out to make life very easy for you. It's a lot of changes taking place in these reforms in this time period. So please be astute enough to pay attention to this thing. The first thing I want to talk about is following the War of 1812. America, as I said, we gained no land. We didn't pay out any money. Really, very little was gained. If you're thinking from the British point of view, nothing was gained by them from that 3-year war. But America had everything to gain. 1, the respect of the Europeans. And number 2, pride in one's country. We call that nationalism. Now, nationalism, when it goes too far, that's where you get Hitler. Okay, that's where you get Mussolini. Okay, that's gone too far. But nationalism is what happens when maybe in the Olympics and your team goes on and defeats, as the underdog, the one that was supposed to win it. Okay, this is what had taken place in America was we began developing a national culture. And so we're going to be talking about what that looks like and what it feels like as we go through this. And what enables this is there's an immense distance between Europe and America. And America's about right saying, you know what, we want to establish our own thing. It's like when you leave your home and you've been taught by your parents for those 18 years, let's say, and then you go off to college. And maybe you're only go 35 miles away, or maybe you're going to go 3,500 miles away. You're going to begin establishing your own culture. You're going to keep some things of your parents, but you're also maybe going to try new things, throw things out, start over. I can remember even a few of my acquaintances, they even changed their last name because they were kind of disgusted by their father or parents, etc. And so, everyone wants to kind of start a new culture. So America was no different, and you begin seeing our educational systems, our art system, our literature system, even religious systems are beginning to undo, and rewrite new ideas of this. We call this the Romantic era. The Romantic era is the opposite of what you have when you're looking at Aristotelian thought or Plato thought, where everything or Hegelian thought, like the Germans, everything is supposed to kind of be rigid and goes in these thoughts of logic. But with Romantic, it's throwing out the logic and begin embracing the emotional aspects, the passionate aspects, the idea that through nature one can find truth, and in that truth one can find virtue and live harmoniously with others, as well as with God Himself. And so this Romantic era really helped springboard America into understanding these ideas of our importance of human passion, the mysteries of nature around us, and the virtues of this idea of how common folk can work together. This is one such thing. Because of the printing press, we now can begin working with our youth. Now, this is obviously for the wealthy kids, since public education is something we'll be talking about, but it isn't for everybody. But this is a book that a mother, remember the Republican motherhood, or the cult of domesticity, she can be using to help train her children up into just knowing their times tables and working on literacy during that time. Well, there was this idea of the Second Great Awakening. If you remember, in the First Great Awakening, it was definitely about the idea of a reaction to the Enlightenment. And it was there that the pastors railed against where reason and God were intersecting, and for some, they were okay with that. that's what became as the New Lights. And if you remember, then the old guard were like, no, we're stodgy, we don't do that. That's what called the Old Lights. And so this was what was taking place as a reaction again to the Enlightenment. Well, and this new one is this idea that man can be made a little more perfect, or as they pursue God or religious practices, we might be able to perfect the human experience. And so these new aspects really caused social and economic changes to begin taking place. And it also began creating this idea of religious revivals that I think helped spur on this social movements that were taking place. Well, the Second Great Awakening was spurred by this guy named Charles Finney, who I believe was trained in Yale, was trained to become a lawyer, but had a calling of God, left his calling of going in to become a lawyer, and went on in a powerful way, became an itinerant preacher, and traveled to the outskirts of the major epicenters or the major industrial and population areas. And for instance, Erie Canal might be one of them. And he went and talked with such powerful oratorical presence that those who were there were drawn to this message of good works, of living simply, of striving a way to find a sense that we too can become better at what we're doing. And it is this Second Great Awakening, I hope that we'll talk about a little bit later in the next chapter, is what's going to compel many people to join this abolitionist movement or speaking out against slavery. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about how they called to, cleaning up their lives and living better and avoiding alcohol and those types of things. What made this type of situation rather unique is that it seemed to be going to areas where boom towns were, where they're new. As we kept moving westward and further and pushing the bounds of westward expansion, towns would emerge, and these itinerant preachers like Finney would go, and men, women, but mostly women, and the poor would go and hear that message and be drawn to this type of message for them. During this time, we also began seeing different examples of a social and moral reform taking place. I don't want to call them fringe groups, but in groups that were outside the Methodist and outside of the Baptist tradition. And this form took shape in many ways. You see the Jewish communities there starting synagogues in the major epicenters, especially around New York, where they had congregated. You begin seeing them reach out to the immigrants that had already been present there, whether they're the Scots-Irish, or whether they were the Germans, or even the new ones that are starting to come in and begin trickling in here in the future after the Civil War, that will be coming in from Eastern Europe, let's say. But the most interesting group that's taking place there is, you see, there's a thing called the Society of Friends that refused to fellowship with people who were an outsider. Another group, the Quakers, kind of cool, is that they preached against the alcohol war and, more importantly, slavery. So they're very minded of what war can cause, but also the evils of slavery. Where will you find the Quakers? They're in Pennsylvania, again, striving to find peace, just like we did in the prior time period as well. And then we get to this group of people of Joseph Smith and eventually Brigham Young, where they have a set of beliefs that were rather unique to them, and they pursued a way in which they can create a theocracy. And by creating a theocracy, so that you would have certain religious leaders kind of driving their decision, they felt persecuted there in Missouri and other parts of the Union, and they fled to an area which we now know as the Utah Territory to begin their own form of experiencing God and their own reformed system as well. So close to 12,000 of them going there and creating a very incredible, industrious, and unique people group there that have been influential in the territorial expansion there in the West. Well, transcendentalism is a rather unique term, is that it's causing us to remove ourselves, so to transcend our physical body and to go look at something that's bigger and more beyond ourself. It essentially means to look inside ourselves in order to find a truth that will allow us to almost understand and touch God in some way. So it's not a formal religion, but it is meant to kind of be a moral compass for people who listen to it. And so Ralph Waldo Emerson, as I read to you at the start of this lecture, was the founder of the movement, and he was talking about find truth not in organized religion, but find truth in nature, find truth in science, find truth in these noble things that you can find of yourself. So he was raised within the church, but he began recognizing that maybe we don't even want to call this God, but more of a universal truth or a universal being, and that you can access this universal being through nature in and of itself. You'll see Emerson's work, David Thoreau's work, you'll see Margaret Fuller's work, these things all really taking place in trying to find a way to sync or blend how nature and science and a belief in a higher power are crucial to this. Please, you do need to recognize that in this transcendental movement, remember, America's trying to create their own identity. Very, very much different than that is found in Europe. And with transcendentalism, I think this resonated a strong chord with people who couldn't really recognize that organized religion was for them either. I love to talk about, well, I'll say this for the next slide, but the Hudson River School is a unique thing that most paintings, if you were to go to Europe this time, you'd see pictures of nobles because they're the ones that are paying for it. You'll see pictures of the nobles and their fields around them. You'll see people working. You'll see everyday life kind of drawn out. But with these ideas of transcendentalism, you begin seeing pictures of landscapes where you imagine man or woman has gone to touch the bounds of heaven, to be a part of what God is doing or the higher power is doing during this time period. This was a unique thing that Ralph Waldo Emerson was doing, or Thoreau was doing. If you don't know anything about Thoreau, I mean, for 2 years, the guy just outside of Boston in Walden's Ponds, which is near Concord, he lived in a little house, a makeshift house, for 2 years to kind of escape what was happening around him in order to kind of better connect with nature and better connect to understand how these transcendental ideas can be used to influence culture. A huge, huge departure. One such famous person that helps bring a romanticized view. Look at this here. You see this picture here in front is of nature before man has touched it. Man has conquered it. Man has forced it into its own ways here. This comes to light in Bierstadt. I hope someday you'll have a chance to go either visit the White House or Library of Congress or some of the Nature History Museum. Bierstadt alone has done these paintings that stand almost 22 feet in height and in width of about 9 feet. And he has just 3 of them alone that are just meant to be in awe of American landscape. And that is what America was, especially as during this time period we're going from shore to shore, and this soon to be called manifest destiny, whereas ours for the taking begins to appear. This is revealed in our transcendental art that is emerging during this time. Well, we need to remind ourselves that women are the motor, women are the glue, women are the fuel to much of these reforms that are taking place. We call it the Republican motherhood. You do need to recognize, what is the difference between the cult of domesticity and that of the Republican motherhood. Cult of domesticity that was talked about in the prior time period is where you're passing on your values from what your family's about to your children and teaching them. It's like a homeschool mom. Republican motherhood is gearing your kids up to become appropriate Americans. And what does it look like to be an appropriate American? Okay, and so that's, I guess, is the distinction of that. The second thing that these women had done in the varieties of reform is they got engaged into the lives of the poor, the destitute, the hurting. For instance, one gal, I'm forgetting her name, I want to say Dorothea Dix, D-I-X. She went into, came from money, and went off to college, graduated from college, and she could have easily went and married and opted not to. She went into writing, and as a writer, she began doing expose types of investigation things. And it was there that she willingly went into an asylum for women. And she saw the deplorable conditions that she was enduring for the month that she was there. We're talking, cold showers and degrading situations where, don't need to go into too much detail, and fecal matter in the room that wasn't ever cleaned up. She just saw the horrific things, and so she brought these things to light. And this is what helped generate reforms within the mental health community, but also this is going to be reform that will begin leading into the prison reform areas that we're going to probably address when we get into more of the 1890s to the 1910s. Okay, but for right now, it is this stuff that begins to influence what is taking place. But it's also going to begin allowing us to dive into areas that might not be part of our normal thing. Okay, so I got a little ahead of myself on this slide, but this is what I get for just doing these right off the cuff of my mind. There is a problem with poverty that's taking place. And in a priority member of 1837, if you remember, the second bank in the United States collapsing under because Andrew Jackson refused to re-sign to re-enlist that bank again. 5 years later, we have an eventual collapse with Martin Van Buren as the president, and this causes the government to be unable to meet the needs. But because of these reforms and women engaging in this, pulling their husbands into it, we begin seeing private charitable efforts emerging during this time. And that's, like I said earlier, Dorothea Dix stepping in and recognizing that even the most marginalized people need help. However, at the same time, I find it very interesting that if you're someone coming in as an immigrant, namely the Irish, they were poorly treated, and often given derogatory statements and made about them. For instance, one of them was Nina, non-Irish need apply, or no Irish need to apply, and this would be posted in their door. And people would say, oh, I guess I can't go there if they're Irish. So this is a very tough time where we begin seeing Americans, even though we want to reform, even want to make others' lives better, for some reason we're feeling that because they're Catholic and poor, Irish, and they're coming with no education, that they're there to take our jobs, or they're there to cause some problems for us. So this is called nativism, and we're going to see more of this beginning to emerge as we go through every time America goes through some crisis or goes through some sort of financial hardship of sorts. So this temperance movement is started mostly because of these religious engines are trying to challenge us. Remember, the Second Great Awakening is that we too can begin making changes and living out good works, if you will, to become more God-like or Christ-like in our everyday behavior. Well, one such thing is there was a guy, I forget his first name, but his last name is Dow, D-O-W. He owned a factory there in Maine, and he saw what happened when immigrants would come up. Doesn't matter if they're German or Irish, predominantly those two, but they would drink way too much. They would come to work the next day and be incapable of working. He saw how much money he lost for their lost time of labor and the quality of work that he was able to get out of them and the quality of product that he was able to sell. He's like, oh my gosh, this is just getting lame. At the same time, there were women who were seeing that total families were being abandoned within the immigrant communities, made by men who were dissipating their life, who were throwing their lives away because of the alcohol. Well, up started this American Temperance Society that they call themselves the Cold Water Army, and they send out pamphlets to encourage wives and husbands and bosses to get their employees to quit drinking, so that way they can begin addressing the issues that this alcoholism was creating in that. And so this created a huge revival in religious experiences, but it also became a challenge to people to really, frankly, consider shifting from moderation of alcohol to complete abstinence from this. Maine was the first state of the Union of 1851 to begin this push to make legal reforms to where it made it abstinent, that you must abstain from alcohol, where many other states took their law to begin making changes to influence how it was done in their own regions. So here you see, art being done of that time period to share and convey the abuse that often happened at the hands of men who could not handle their alcohol. At this same time of reform, we need to examine out in the wilderness, not in the big cities per se. So, this wilderness movement, there was a group of people, I'm not saying that were too different than the Mormons who wanted to go off and create their own theocratic society out there in Utah territory where 12,000 of them went to escape persecution. There are entire people who wanted to reform society, but at a faster, quicker pace than what religion was doing. And so these communities formed utopian societies where they all had some sort of generic idea of what they wanted to do. Okay, so for instance, one there in Indiana, I forget the name of it, but in Indiana he was working with factory workers where they were trying to create some sort of product, and it was there that it lasted for about 22 years where they kind of collectively worked in making these products. But in this idea of working in community, it eventually broke under the debt that the company owned there in Indiana, and they could no longer do this. But at the same time, up in Massachusetts was this place called the Brook Farm Center, where in Brook Farm basically followed ideas of communism and this idea of model community where they can continue to work and create jobs that would be collectively shared. And so they had 200 acres that they attempted to farm as best as they could, men and women together, and try to raise crops that they would then eventually share. You'll still see there's a Brook Farm type of yogurt that you can find in different supermarkets to this day that harkens back to this cooperative that was started back in the 1840s. So it's kind of a cool thing where you have women on equal terms as men in the Brook Farm community there in Massachusetts. An even more unique experience that some of you might want to be aware of is the Oneida community. Now, Oneida was started by a fringe group of people that up like in the New York area, and they believed that Christ's coming had already happened, and that to have heaven on earth now, we need to create equality for men and women. And what made this kind of interesting is that marriage was a loose concept. It was free love. Men and women can collectively share and have relations with each other. Now, today that might even continue to be weird, and this is how liberal of a society we are. Can you imagine how in 1848, when this was happening, how this was rather off the chart crazy to be thinking about in this utopian community? Why is it significant that this Oneida community should be discussed right now? Is that how this is an empowering tool for women to begin making choices about who they choose to be with, not the other way around. So please be aware of that. Now, the Oneida community, interestingly enough, went from that free love, free casualness, working together, and what made it unique and why it lasted. Actually, this Oneida community existed all the way up until 2008. Seriously, that long period of time. But it started making silverware. So think of Oneida and the forks and the spoons and the knives, spooning, get that little relational type of component there. And they used that to help support their philosophy of a community. Well, over time, it eventually got bought out by a larger corporation, and they went from a commune, socialism kind of idea, to where they were bought by a company, and then that company went on to make the Oneida utensils and silverware and plates, etc. To eventually they went out of business, like I said earlier. So, but a cool idea of how these in the wilderness, these utopian ideas of reform were taking shape across the landscape of America. And what is even cooler is that they mostly were allowed to have their experiments, whereas this probably wouldn't have taken place in a whole lot of other places across the globe at that time. Well, we're back again, Golden Bears, and this one now talking about a very challenging and ugly part of American history, the underbelly, if you will, that deserves being ripped open and the contents of our guts being exposed so we can hopefully take out the cancer as a nation, as you see here in contemporary times, and address some real issues that we have. Love this quote by Abraham Lincoln in 1859. "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long to retain it." The irony of Thomas Jefferson in 1801, and as we are at the dawn of this new republic of 1776, TJ himself is a slave owner. And here he is as the writer of the Declaration of Independence, the most brilliant mind of 33 years old, and talking about the Declaration and the rights of man that we have and independence and the Lockean philosophy. He knew in his mind that, He knew in his mind that at some point he would have to free his slaves, because either he believed what this idea of the rights of man were, or that he did not. And so on one hand, TJ was probably going to let them go, but on the other hand, he recognized that perhaps just this idea of slavery and the institution, the economies of it, just wouldn't last. It was in its destiny to basically dry up and fizzle out, because the ability of having the sugar, the ability to have the rice, the ability to have the tobacco, it just was going to deplete. But along comes Eli Whitney in 1793, 1793, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, this invention and the market revolution that it brought, and essentially sealed that the seat for every slave was be on top of that cotton gin, and the motor that would keep the cotton growing and keeping the wallets thick is the cotton itself. And what goes on is that this huge trade begins to emerge where the cotton is grown and harvested. More slaves are needed for this. They get shipped down the Mississippi, get sent over to England, and we now have England, 75% of its textile industries, which provides almost 20% of just the labor of all of England. 25% of the workforce, 20% of it, I'm sorry, depend on the cotton coming from the South. Talking about an influence that the Southerners have now with this thing, it kind of became a solution that America was definitely going to be struggling with, and will be something that we talk about to this situation today. I'm mindful of a study that was done by Stanford. I know I'm departing from, I normally tell a story of my life. I thought, hey, let's get out of my narcissistic, meaningless life and share with you about a study done by Stanford. And it's really talking about self-esteem. And the study was this. They took a group of 30 kids, middle school age kids, and they put them in a room. And they told 2 kids that regardless of the answer, you're always going to say orange. Okay? Orange. And then they go through, and these 2 kids are really popular. These 2 kids were kind of the class leaders of school, etc. And so then the other 28 were basically given this type of question. I'm making up these colors, but it's just the same idea. But during Halloween, what 2 colors will you find predominantly on most of the merchandise? And they have purple, yellow, and orange. Now, most logical-minded people would know orange is the go-to color. And so what had happened is they then said, okay, everybody, can you go ahead and stand, and can you go choose a corner as to where you think this belongs? Now, to make this work is that the 2 kids that I think I might have made a mistake, they were told to go to purple, and guess where they went? They went to the purple corner. And the other 28 kids were like, well, I know purple isn't a color for October or for Halloween. I know the other yellow, I mean, that's not one of those things. Orange is the only logical thing. But because this is about identity issues, Guess where the other 28 went? They followed where those other 2 leaders had gone. Why? So they don't stand out or look different from the rest of them. Even if, and this is the video that they showed, I've seen it, and there was some research done in writing, there were a couple of like looking around going, wait a minute, this isn't making sense, but everybody else is over there, I might as well go join that one as well. This idea that we're talking about now is there's nothing that makes sense about slavery. There are even still to this day that, as they've unpacked, historians do, and have looked back and traced the economics of this, the feasibility of this, the ugliness of this, they're like, this shouldn't have happened in the way it did. We had these, the Compromise of 1820, Compromise of 1850. We have these nullification crises. We have all these times in which the politicians of America could have set the course right, but guess what? They were told orange, yet they went with purple instead. And this is what is going to lead us into that collision course that we all know as the Civil War. So the beginnings of this anti-slavery movement is that the idea of cotton becomes a cash crop that becomes really, really, really marketable. Okay, but before we get to that, we need to recognize that there were Northerners that wanted to get rid of it. And they felt that this idea of slaves was wrong, and that by them saying it's okay to do it, that they were complicit in this institution. And so on one hand they were against it, but on the other hand, many of those in the North had factories. Many of those in the North, they were making items with the cotton or to turn it into textiles. And so they were, on one hand, we disagree with it, but on the other hand, I certainly like to line my wallets with this. And so it was a very challenging thing for them to make that decision. Really the only group at this time that would speak out and would lead against this idea of this abolitionist movement were those of the Quakers. So please know that you love to think the people in the North were always in favor of getting rid of it. Yeah, they were in favor of it intellectually, but in practice they did not. I mean, in fact, there's one instance when Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist writer who was an African-American slave, got his freedom from that, went on to write a great narrative of that. You might read about that in your English class. You know where he's treated the worst? Not in the South. It was when he went to the North. In fact, one town actually tied him up and then dragged him behind a horse throughout town. So this is the discrepancy between where people knew the right answer was orange, but they went with the purple side. And this was no different, as then as it could be now. Well, some of the early people of this were some that we need to chat about. We have William Lloyd Garrison, who began writing this abolitionist newspaper. He's African American himself, called The Liberator. And what is unique about him is that he was kind of a radical, because he was arguing that what would happen since all these Africans were taken without their choice? What if we create an entire area of, like in Africa, it's called Liberia, and their capital is Monrovia, which the president at the time was Monrovia. What if we created over there an area where they can go and live on their own, escape all of this here and be? So it's a very interesting idea, very radical. And so he organized this anti-American slave society that you need to be aware of, and that he recognized that if we're not ever going to, politics isn't ever going to change, that maybe there needs to be some sort of political ideology or political shift through this. There's other people you've heard about as the Underground Railroad. Maybe you haven't heard about the Sarah Angela Grimke sisters, an incredible thing that they worked hard to speak out against slavery of that time. So please research them and know a little bit about them as we go. Well, as abolitionists gain more strength in numbers, there's a greater degree of violence that are erupting with them. And the people in the North, like I alluded to, they don't want to have this trade stopped, because they need to fill their boats with the cotton and the rum and the rice and the other things. Why? Because they ship those over to England. What does England do? They ship back all of the finished goods, the pots, the pans, the furniture, the wallpapers, all these things, the china, the porcelain, Eastern stuff coming from China, you name it, because England was the biggest trading partner globally at the time. So shipping those things there was important in order for them to bring things back, in order for those people in the middle to make the money that they had. And so this was the time where you begin seeing that America is splintering, and some are beginning to speak out of the ugliness and the injustice that slavery was bringing, but you also see others on the other side of it saying, no, this is kind of how it has been. We call it a peculiar institution down here in the South, and this is just the way we do the way we do. Well, the thing that you need to recognize is that women were often the most politically and agile aspect of these abolitionist movements. And so what made it powerful is that women identified with the slaves because they weren't given certain inalienable rights that they felt the Declaration was for, just as much as the women were not being able to vote. They call it the suffrage movement. And so both of them began joining together and kind of raising collectively this voice of women's rights and also the rights of the African American. And why can't we find them? But what was to the chagrin of that is that, just as you saw in the 1840 election, we talked about in the last lecture, where women were encouraged to participate in this platform, but just don't vote, okay? Here they're encouraged to speak into these things, but don't go too far, because here you'll see that they were excluded from speaking in public or holding some sort of powerful role. And this is what forced them to have to go, like Lucretia Mott that you see here. She had to leave America to go over and join in London, who at the time was really the leading proponent for ending slavery, not just from British ships and buying them. And by the way, that's a side note that if you ever heard the word of the song Amazing Grace, how great the sound, that was written by a guy who used to be a slave trader from England, who had his life challenged and dedicated to God, and he then spent the rest of his life trying to fight it. His name was, the author wasn't, but it falls under the William Wilberforce traditions. And so Lucretia Mott left America and advocated and joined other global countries who were trying to cancel this. I mean, Mexico officially got rid of slavery before America officially had done. I think it was 1828 or 1829. So America is woefully behind, and Lucretia Mott is like, come on, we should be able to do this faster and better than we are, and we haven't. Sadly, she came home from her trip in Europe. Her boat sank off the coast of New York, and her voice was squelched by the bottoms of death found at the bottom of the ocean. Another gal with Lucretia Mott is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You need to know her name, especially for the feminists out there. I'm not saying that at all derogatory, but this is where we see in 1848 the Seneca Falls Convention. Please know that this is where a declaration was written out, just like the Declaration of Independence, just like Thomas Jefferson, where they're saying we have rights as women, and we need to have these be known. They're called the Declaration of Sentiments. Notice they didn't put rights. That would have been too bold. They called it sentiments, or wishes that we hope. And so this time period of an ending in 1848 is significant because this is a unique document, but a unique time that is going to really kind of capture for us what is a reform move of this reform movement time period that we're talking about, and what this alludes to. And we have as well, in the politics, we have two different parties in the 1840s to determine, do we want to kind of deal with this of slavery issue, or do we not want to deal with this slavery issue? So we have the Liberty Party on one hand that is arguing for, maybe we oppose slavery being extended in different areas. Notice they're not canceling slavery, okay? They just are opposed to it, and they believe that African Americans should have a little bit more involvement in the politics. So they were, remember, the African Americans still had a 3/5 vote that it counts for them in the South. So it's kind of an interesting thing, even though they can't vote, but they are counted by the Southerners at that point. So they want to make sure that is resolved. But then you have the same time the Free Soil Party that emerged at the end of this time period that we're talking about in 1848, who want to make sure that they're not looking at slavery as the morality of it. We're just making sure that the states that open in the South won't have African Americans or won't have slavery allowed there, so that way they have more chance for economic gain in the land that's happening. So now it's even, these social reforms, these abolition reforms are touching upon the political realm and creating some things. I create a little Venn diagram so you can see how are they different. But there in the middle you can see is that abolition is the key issue, and this idea of how do the slaves in the South, do they count? So with that, I keep it real, keep it classy, Golden Bears, and hope you have a good rest of the day.